Do reviews come from within us or from beyond? Let's talk about Nosferatu.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are back, the Eye of the Storm podcast. Today, we will be discussing or debating Nosferatu. But before we get into Nosferatu, we're here to give you movie recommendations. So you already know what time it is. Guys, what's the best recent thing that you've seen?
I tried a few things this week, not too successful. I tried to Leave the World Behind on Netflix. It was interesting, but I kind of got halfway through and I kind of lost interest in that movie. And I also tried Black Doves, which was a series on Netflix as well. But again, I think I checked out after halfway through the first episode and didn't return to that. So a bit difficult this week. I did actually rewatch the first hour of The Batman. And I just wanted to say again, how brilliant that opening of The Batman is, in terms of the setting the scene of Gotham, setting the scene as to where the Batman is, where he is on this journey and being the Batman. Just how they set the mood and the vibes of Gotham in this as well, and just his presence as Batman in this movie. It's just brilliant. It's just phenomenally done. I was genuinely again falling in love with the movie all over again. So I'd say that's my best recent thing to watch. If you haven't watched the latest Batman, I would highly recommend checking out that movie. Honestly, for me, it's near perfect.
For me, it was a struggle. I can't even lie, to try and watch some films because I had family over and they all just recently left. So yeah, it was really hard to watch some stuff. But I did manage to sneak in The Cage. It was a series, actually. I managed to watch that with the family. That was really good. So that was an amateur fighter, UFC fighter, based in Paris, becomes a star overnight by knocking out a pro UFC fighter. And this pro UFC fighter is an a-hole. So yeah, so it's literally his journey trying to becoming that star and breaking into the UFC, and obviously leading up to the main fight with the guy that he knocked out. And yeah, there's just a whole journey, a whole story, and this whole madness that happens. But I really like French films and TV shows, and this one was really good. I would actually recommend it. It's called The Cage on Netflix.
So the best thing I watched this week was The Package, which is a 2018 Netflix movie. And it's essentially about a group of teenagers who go to the woods to go camping. And as they kind of party and get drunk, things get a little out of hand, and one of them accidentally cuts off a vital part of his body. So they panic and they call for help, and then the friend gets airlifted out to the nearest hospital, and they put the severed body part in one of the ice boxes and hand that to the medics. And the plan is that they will wait until the morning, hike back to the car, and then rejoin their friend in the hospital. And then as they talk and process what has happened, they realize that they gave the medics the wrong icebox. And so now they have about 12 hours to get to the hospital and to get the package to their friend. And the whole thing is this wacky, raunchy comedy that essentially turns into a road trip at that point, where they go from one disaster to the next as they try to get to their friend before time runs out. And it's very funny. It's very, the characters are not the most interesting, but they all work. They all have their part in the story. And it's just one creative joke after the next. And it's pretty rare for a movie to actually get an emotional response out of me. And this one actually managed to gross me out and actually caused me to actually kind of back off from the screen a little bit because of what I was seeing. And it's this pretty obscure Netflix comedy that on paper sounds like it should be nothing special. There's 20 that look exactly the same, but this one I thought was funnier and cleverer about its jokes than the others I've seen. And I was very pleasantly surprised. I put this on late Sunday evening, didn't expect much from it, and before I knew it, I was actually enjoying myself. So that would be my recommendation.
All right, then. Looks like it's time for the main event. Please let the people know what the hell Nosferatu is about.
So this week we're talking about Nosferatu, which is a remake of a 1922 German Gothic horror movie, which was in the first place essentially a rip-off of the Dracula story. So the story follows a German lawyer in the late 1800s who is hired to travel to Transylvania to carry out this real estate deal with this eccentric noble who wants to move to this German city. And as he's there, he discovers that the Count is a vampire who, once he gets to Germany, brings kind of a plague with him, and he begins stalking the people of that city. And he specifically singled out Ellen, who is the lawyer's wife, who kind of has had this psychic bond with him. And as the Count makes his way to the city and sets up shop there, his influence over the city and over other people begins to grow. And then a group of people organize to try to fight back. It's essentially the story. So what did we think of Nosferatu?
So the things that I liked about the movie, I think it had a great atmosphere. The dark, gloomy setting that it was in was sort of perfect for the movie. So a lot of like the shots in this movie, how like dark and like gritty everything was, how eerie the whole like approach to the castle was, and like how like the shots of like the horse and carriage coming at him. I feel like they did a really good job of conveying it like a really like dark and like gloomy and and just creepy like vibe throughout the movie. And then that's coupled in with how Orlok's design in this. Like I was like properly grossed out by the way that he looked and the way that he was represented in this. And even like some of the stuff that was happening in the movie, I was like properly like grossed out by it. And I don't know whether that was like the sole purpose of it. I was really like weirded out and like really grossed out about kind of like what was going on the screen. So I'll give that as like positive because it had that emotional reaction out of me. On the more negative side of things, I don't think this was for me, and I'm not going to be like super negative on it because I don't think it's like a horrible movie. I appreciate that it had its like style and its like aesthetics that it was trying to go for, and like it was trying to be kind of like somewhat faithful to the 1929 version of the movie. But again, like for one, I like the whole like vampire story and like him being super in love with this woman and whatever like that initially isn't for me to start off with. And then just how things were moving, it just felt like everything was like quite slow paced, and like I just wasn't really invested in the story that was being told on the screen. So that was kind of more my negatives of the movie, but I appreciate it for what it was aiming to do for people that are more invested in this particular genre. So that's kind of my initial thoughts.
I thought it was a solid horror. However, there wasn't anything special about the film, but it definitely was a good solid horror. I think especially when it comes to making, obviously he's pretty much the Dracula, but in terms of like the whole evilness behind his character, I think that was definitely like executed, I wouldn't say to perfection, but it was definitely like a talking point of the movie. There's a scene which pretty much like reaches the pinnacle of his evil, and the way that scene was done, I wasn't even really expecting. I didn't even think they would even show it, but the fact that they showed it, I was like, whoa. Like, I'll speak about it later, but I think when it comes to just the Dracula story and like Count Orlok, when it comes to Orlok, and even like the way that he was kind of like presented in the film, like I remember like he even had like severe asthma issues, and the way that he would like speak, and it's like, god damn, like it was very, everything just felt very intense. So I think that was done really good, and I understand why there's mixed feelings on it. I think this is definitely like in terms of like for filmmakers, I think this movie as a filmmaker, I can see why they would love it. However, I do see why there's mixed feelings. I think it's mainly to do with the pacing of the movie. Even though I do think there was like a goodish balance with the quiet suspense and the shocking burst of violence, right? And obviously mixed with like disturbing imagery. So I think like there was like a good balance. However, at times it did kind of feel slow, and to see how like what it amounted to at the end with Count Dracula's story, I was like, okay, that felt kind of, I wouldn't say anticlimactic, well, like depressing in a way. Cause I was like, oh, to see how it ended, I was like, okay, I get that, I get why they did it like that, but the way it ended, it was like I wouldn't have expected that conclusion to happen for such a character like Nosferatu. For like an average man, human being, yeah, but for Nosferatu, I was like, I get it why they did that, but still, it was like, Orlok's story kind of like amounted to nothing. And like, this is the freaking Dracula we're talking about. We're not talking about Next Man.
So this movie taught me that I might simply not like Gothic horror, which is not what I would expect. Like the imagery and the vibes and everything is all great, but I've never really seen a Gothic horror movie or experienced a Gothic horror story in any medium, where I really walked away satisfied. And I think this movie is so good in terms of its execution and the skill and the care that went into it, and how deliberate everything is, and how thoughtful and polished everything is, that if this doesn't work for me, then probably nothing will. I think we broadly agree on this one. I think the imagery is amazing. I think the vibes and the tone is amazing. I think the performances are great. It's the story where I'm a little bit ambivalent about it, specifically the ending in terms of how he is actually defeated in the end. It probably works on a thematic or symbolic level, but it does not make any sense to me on a literal level. And that is a little bit of a shame, because I think Robert Eggers is a really good filmmaker. I've only seen The Lighthouse of his, but I really like, at least on paper, I really like his approach of this, like this historically based horror, where he really gets into the head of a particular time and place, and then tries to find the horror in that. And everything about how the time and the era was realized, like how people spoke and how they looked and how the town looked and how people behaved, all of that was great. It's the plot that's a little bit lacking, and I think that is exactly how it was in the German original from 100 years ago. And I think that might be to its detriment that it didn't update that at all, or made some things maybe more explicit, or took a second step at particular plot points. And because of that, it kind of makes the same mistakes that the original made in terms of story. And I was really on board with it for like over the first hour, and I thought this is amazing. And then the last 20 minutes or so were really frustrating to me, because it simply wasn't doing what I wanted it to do. And I think when you look at the reviews for this movie, they are 50% 5-star, 50% 1-star. Like, it's very polarizing. Like, some people are really into this and some people aren't. And at least in terms of the story overall work for me, I'm in the second camp, unfortunately, because I think this is a really well-made movie. It just doesn't do what I would want a movie like this to do. Let's talk about it.
I think it's mainly getting like its flowers from the filmmaker aspects of it, rather than like it being a good movie. Because that's why it's weird, this one, because it has like you said, it's 50-50 in terms of the opinion. Like, if you check on Google reviews, it's close, like 50%, not 50%, but like 1-star and 5-star is pretty much close to each other. So I was like, yo, that's it's crazy, but it's understandable. Do you think that the movie is just weird? Because the reason why it hasn't resonated with a lot of people is because it's just like a weird film. And it, people, I don't think a lot of people understand the story. And I don't think people a lot of people understand Orlok's motivation, as in like, why is he so obsessed with this girl's particular blood?
I can't find it inaccessible because I've seen The Lighthouse. And The Lighthouse is just a chore to watch. And like, but in a way that is very deliberate and intentional. It's not a chore to watch because it's bad. It's a chore to watch because it's deliberately made inaccessible. And it's kind of hard to describe if you haven't seen that movie. But like, compared to this, he's really trying to be accessible here. At least for the first hour and a half or so. The plot is pretty linear. The characters make it very explicit what they do and why they do it. It's just towards the very end where there's like this 15-20 minute sequence where they kind of drop a whole bunch of exposition to make the plot make sense. And I found myself zoning out, because it suddenly, there was suddenly this rapid fire. Like, we have a checklist to work through of things we have to tell you. And I found it really hard to keep up with that. But then the actual ending hinged on what was said in those 20 minutes. So, for example, von Franz says at one point that the vampire's curse can be broken if a mortal woman kind of traps him, something like that. Like, basically what Ellen does at the end, right? Like, that is the way the vampire's curse can be broken. And I just missed that line. Because it was one line, it was said very quickly, and I didn't know why it worked in the first place. Like, I think if this was a new story and not something that Eggert wanted to retell, I think that part would have been more explicit, because that's kind of the most important thing, right? That kind of gets to the core of what the Nosferatu is, and because that would explain why his curse can be broken in this way and why he's unable to resist it. And because I didn't get that from the movie. And I'm not even sure which parts of that were explained. Like, some parts were, but I don't know that they all were. And I think they definitely weren't made explicit enough. I think something like this needs to be driven home throughout the movie, where, like, I think there are some things you have to make really obvious, And then there are other things which can be more subtle that maybe you need 2 or 3 viewings to actually pick up on. But like the most basic plot mechanics of it should be really obvious or easy to grasp. And I don't know that this is. I don't really understand, first of all, why Ellen knows that this is what she needs to do. It might be that just she has this telepathic link, and so she just knows because she's been in communion with Orlok. But I didn't get that from the movie either. Or maybe von Franz told her, but I don't remember him telling her. And then I don't know why Orlok is unable to resist it. Now, it might be that because he's a magical creature, he's compelled to do this. A lot of mythological creatures are like this, where they don't have free will in that sense. They have to do certain things. Like they're compelled to behave in certain ways. And if you know what those ways are, then you can trick them and outsmart them. And maybe that is what's happening here. And maybe this makes sense if you know very specific folklore or mythology or something. Or maybe there is a line buried somewhere in the dialogue that explains this, but I didn't catch it. And so I was disoriented in the last 10 minutes because I just didn't know why this was happening, why Ellen was doing this, and why it worked.
There was a scene where it says something about because he woke her up or something like that.
So she wakes him up.
Yeah.
She has the psychic potential or the strong psychic mind that allows her to make a connection with Orlok, and that's what happens in the very beginning, right? She's very low, like in the beginning, which I believe is a new scene. I don't believe this was in the original. She's lonely and she's kind of mentally crying out, and that connects her with Orlok, and that he's like over in Transylvania in his eternal slumber, and her psychic cry for help wakes him up, and so they have this connection. That's why he zeroes in on her. That
is the connection, obviously, behind the obsession. But it just seems like it just doesn't really seem like I wouldn't say good enough reason, but for Orlok's character, it just seems very basic and like I say, like it seems like a human type of craving. You know what I'm saying? That's why.
And I think this comes down to, like, I've read some reviews about this because I walked away kind of ambivalently, and we criticize a movie for not making sense. There's at least a chance that you simply didn't get it, right? That the movie does give you the answer and you just didn't catch it, and that's entirely possible with this. But so I kind of went out to look at some reviews to kind of see what I was missing, and there wasn't much that I found. Like, people are gushing about like how emotionally rich this is, and about the deep symbolism and the emotional vibes of it, and I kind of left asking, that's it? Like that's why this is happening?
It's making it more than it actually is. I already saw like a comment. Someone said it's the best film of the year, bearing in mind the year just started. So I don't know what the hell you were talking about.
I think from a point of view of the cinematography, like it looks gorgeous. It creates a really good sense of place. I think the way the entire the city is realized is great. There's lots of background details, and the vibe of it is great. Like the way people talk, it's very rooted in, I don't know just how period accurate it is, but they don't use a lot of modern vernacular, right? They use very old-fashioned turns of phrase and stuff like that. Yeah. And I think you can get maybe a little bit more out of this as a German speaker, because a lot of Old English sounds actually like German, like literally translated German, because the two languages have like historical connections, right? So as you go back in time, English starts sounding more German in terms of how people speak. Like how they phrase and word things. And this movie kind of was kind of backtracking along that historical trajectory and went back like 150 years in the English language. And that made it feel authentic in a way. And I think that's really what Robert Eggers is really good about. It's about creating this sense of time and place. And I think that worked really well. And on top of that, it looks gorgeous. There's a whole bunch of really cool shots, like when Orlok's influence over the city grows, and there's this shadow of his hand creeping over the city. That looks great. All the different like landscape shots in Transylvania look great. When he's kind of stalking Thomas in the castle, that looks amazing. The way he starts out as a decrepit corpse and gets more and more lively over the course of the movie. Like when Thomas first encounters Nosferatu, the guy's basically a corpse. And then with every scene, he looks a little bit more alive, but that's because he's been feeding first on Thomas and then on other people. These details, like when he talks, he sounds old, not just because of his accent, but also just because of the way he talks. It's a bit like Lord of the Rings, remember the Ents, where they talk very slowly and their speech is very heavy. and it feels like a tree is creaking, like wood is creaking. And this is kind of similar, not that it sounds like wood, but it sounds like old and heavy and slow and tired. And I think Orlok is very creepy and very effective in how he's portrayed. And like there are these scenes where he's mesmerizing Thomas, like when Thomas first gets to the castle, and we kind of see things kind of through Thomas's eyes, and he's under kind of the spell of Orlok. And there are these disorienting cuts and perspectives, and he never quite sees the Count clearly. That's because the Count is clouding his mind. Like, all of these things are amazing, I think. It's the story where I've got a few issues, and it's not like it's a disaster or anything like that. It's more like there are certain key things that I think should have been established more clearly and should have been made more clear. But just in terms of, I think when people say this is like a masterpiece of filmmaking, it's because of the images and how it uses light and sound and all of that to create the sense of creepiness and dread and alienness. And why the plot was on its rails and very clear and very linear in the first 3/4 of the movie. That's why I was really enjoying myself, because it's just a joy to watch. Every frame is intentional, and the imagery creates this very dense atmosphere and this living world. It's just a window into this very strange place where people act not like modern people do and stuff like that. It's all great, I think.
No, yeah, that's why I said, like, from a filmmaker's perspective, this is like, I see why they would call this a masterpiece. And I think another, like, not just even for filmmakers, but just for everyone in general, I think another something like a good thing about this film, the whole like vampire lure, because already like the visuals, you know, were like, it was haunting, right? But it felt seductive as well. I don't know how to describe it, but it just felt seductive, so it fitted in well with obviously Orlok's character. Like I said, I think it was a good film, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. It definitely was nothing out of the ordinary. Like I said, I loved the visuals. That was what was kind of like, you know, it was mainly Orlok's character and the visuals was what was, for me, made it a good film. However, when it comes to the story of like the other characters, that's where I think it kind of fell short. I don't know how you guys feel about that.
Well, in what way?
As in, it didn't really feel like main characters. They felt more like their stories. I get it. Like, I understand. Like, obviously, what's her name? The Ellen, and her husband's name again?
Thomas.
Yeah. So, like, their stories made sense. It made sense. It just didn't feel. Well, it didn't feel as big as like. Yeah, it didn't feel as. I don't know. It's hard to describe it, but like whenever they were on screen, they had their moments, but it just wasn't hitting with me. I don't know what it was, but it just wasn't as like eye-catching as or like engaging as Nosferatu. Like, I understand that Nosferatu is the selling point, but still, I think with a movie like this, for it to be classified as a masterpiece, I think everything needs to be like the whole story needs to be engaging. I just think, even though they were kind of like the victims and they were trying to escape Nosferatu, I get that. So that is pretty much the main gist of the film. But it just, I don't know, like whenever they were on screen, it was like, they had their moments, definitely had their moments, and they had uncomfortable and just like gripping moments, but it was just mainly, I just don't know. I just, like, whenever they were together, it's mainly whenever they were together, it was like, that's when I was a bit like zoning out.
Well, I mean, it's not like Dracula where it turns into kind of an action sequence at the end. Like in Dracula, it ends quite differently, where they kind of, I've forgotten the details because it's been a long time since I read it. But essentially, kind of they kind of drive him out of London, and then he's kind of escaping back to Transylvania, and so they chase him and catch up with him and then destroy him. There's more action. The characters have more agency, and then they take more charge of their situation. And that is not really what's happening here, right? Like, Thomas is very much a tragic victim in this. He's basically a damsel in distress, right? Because he is forced to go to Transylvania because that's his one big chance to provide a good life to his family, right? Because they're not doing so well at the moment, but this is his big chance, their big break. And if he secures this, he not only gets a big commission, he also gets a place in this prestigious real estate agency, right? And then Ellen basically has this psychic duel with Nosferatu the entire time. where she's a bit like, once she figures out what's going on and how she can beat him, she takes more charge. But it's very, first of all, there's this long period where she is seemingly ill and she's being dominated by Nosferatu's just psychic presence. Like, he's not specifically controlling her, but I think just the weight of his presence in her mind is causing her all these seizures. And they're going through this entire thing of trying to find a medical treatment for her. But I think once she figures out what the deal is and why and what that presence in her head is, she starts fighting back and she starts co-opting that link to finally kind of manipulate Orlok in the very end. And then we've got Friedrich, who is like the concerned friend who basically just wants the best for his friend, but he doesn't really know how to do it. And he's a bit like, he tries what he knows, but it's never good enough. And it's taking an increasing toll on him and his family. And then there's the mystic, von Franz, right? Who might be the least interesting one because he just shows up with all the answers. But like, I think there's a lot of stuff going on, and maybe like, this is a 100-year-old story, right? So you might have seen the individual pieces before, like this whole thing of, we think this person is sick, but they're actually possessed. Like, and it turns into an exorcism just for 5 minutes at one point, right? When Orlok's psyche kind of pushes through and controls Ellen for a minute. That is something that we've seen in other stories before, right? But I don't know that there was nothing going on or that there was not enough going on. I think there was quite a bit. And I think Ellen's performance specifically is pretty amazing, because she kind of has to be pretty passive throughout all of it, but she's also suffering from these conditions that she can't explain and where nobody can help her. Like, there's all sorts of stuff going on that I think is really interesting. And one of the things that I think this does well and better than I've seen in other versions of the Dracula story is kind of this creeping influence of the vampire even before he arrives in the city. And I thought this was done really quite well. It appears in the dreams, and it appears in Herr Knock's character, right, who basically is one of the people who is among the first to feel Orlok's presence, and he willingly submits as his servant. I think it's familiar pieces because you've seen this in other versions of the same story, but I thought, like, just in terms of how it was done, on balance, it was one of the better ones, if not the best.
I just think there was so much concentration put on Nosferatu, right? Even with the characters, like, they didn't really have moments to themselves that, it doesn't have to be relatable, but there just has to be something about them that makes you want to, root for them. And I was kind of course, by default, you have to root for them, especially when it comes to Ellen, right? Because the way that her interaction with Nosferatu, especially at a young age, and obviously in the beginning scene where she pretty much got, SA'd by Nosferatu at a young age. So, like, of course, like, stuff like that, you're already, like, rooting for them. But they just, for me, just wasn't enough moments between them that made me, like, that made me, I don't know, man. It's just something. There wasn't enough moments for me, because I was just, like, I understand, like, the main focus is on Nosferatu. I understand that, right? So they're trying to figure out how to kind of, like, break free from his obsession, right, and his hold on Ellen. So I understand that, that's the main focus, and that's going to be, like, the main gist of the film. But like, I don't know, but I think there has to be like other things about the character, like the character story shouldn't just revolve around Nosferatu. Because I was like, okay, cool, I'm just waiting for Nosferatu to come back on. Do you get what I'm saying? There has to be something more to the characters as well that kind of, like, makes me want to see them again on the screen. And I hear what you're saying, Daniel, like the whole, psychological battle that she was having, and especially, like, the interactions that the husband had with Nosferatu as well, especially when he went to his castle, house, whatever. That was probably one of the best, like, one of my highlight sequences in the film. It was just like, it had everything. It was like, it was great. Like, it was very uncomfortable in a way, knowing that he was each morning, he doesn't even know what the hell was happening to him. He was feeding on him each day. So just that realization, that was kind of, like, not relatable, but it was kind of like realism in terms of, like, how people are, like, abused in a way, like, they'll get drugged and then stuff will happen. So there was, like, a lot of, you could feel it for him. It was crazy. But I understand that. But for me personally, I just don't know. I didn't, like, there wasn't, like, I didn't have that kind of, like, urgency to want to see them on my screen again. I only had urgency to want to see them when it came near the end and wonder how they're going to beat Nosferatu. And I got see with the countdown that, Nosferatu's countdown, that was definitely, like, the gripping parts. So I was like, okay, it's building up to, it's building up to what it's building up to. And then when it ended up, reaching, day zero, I was like, oh, okay, I was ready to see what was happening. And that was what was anticlimactic.
I would say for me, and I don't know whether this is a hot take, but I wasn't really in love with like a lot of the acting in this. Like everything, like I kind of went into this a little bit blind as to like what to expect in this, and everything felt quite over the top and quite dramatic. I can appreciate it for saying like what they were trying to go for, but for me, it was completely like taking me out, especially like Ellen's character and sort of like the way that she was like writhing her body when she was like kind of like being possessed, and the way that she was like maybe like speaking when she was like having certain conversations and stuff like that. It just felt overly dramatic for sort of for my taste, anyways. And I think Daniel, you kind of done a good job of like contextualizing Orlok's voice at the beginning, but even like that kind of like the booming and like the slow sort of like pace at what he was like speaking, I think I've like already at that point I wasn't really feeling how the story was unfolding. I wasn't really feeling sort of some of the dialogue or some of the sort of kind of over the top dramatization of sort of what was going on. So by the time we got to him, I was a bit like, okay, can you just get out what you want to say? Like it's really like frustrating, like him slowly bellowing sort of what he wanted to say. And again, like I think that's more a personal thing than it being sort of too much of a critique of sort of the movie, because like again, I can appreciate that it fit the style and the approach it was going for, but for me, it was just not hitting and just like really like taking me out of sort of what was actually going on during the movie.
So I've seen a lot of people say that they didn't quite like Orlok in terms of how he's portrayed and how he appears. Some people dislike the voice and the accent. Some people dislike mustache. And I think it all works. And I think it all, first of all, it kind of sells, I think, the idea how old he is and how far gone he is, that he used to be human at one point, but that was a long time ago. And whatever is left of his humanity is not a lot. So I think stuff like that, like everything about him, I think really worked in terms of making the vampire actually a monster and actually not human. And I think if you made him, like if you toned down the accent or if you made him talk faster, I think that would be lost. And at least I never had any problems kind of figuring out what he was saying or what he was doing or anything like that. So that was probably one of my highlights, actually, that they actually made this vampire a monster, which is not a given. Like other versions of Dracula have not been nearly as monstrous as this. Many of them are very, like vampires in general have been kind of romanticized and sanitized a lot. And so whenever a vampire comes along, it's actually a monster and it's actually a predator, I'm on board with it. I'm happy that's happening.
I didn't have too much issues with like the way he looked, and I think it was like properly appropriate for sort of this type of movie for him to be as grotesque as he was. And I actually really liked how like ruthless he was, especially with I can't remember what the guy was, the one that sent Thomas to sort of actually like sign the contract, sign the deal with him, his boss that was offering him up the opportunity. And then when he was like kind of like around him, he was just like, you basically just like kind of like treating him like a dog and just like kind of like ruthless with him. Like everything about that, like I really liked. It was just, and even like after he like kind of started to like some of his kind of like strength back and some of his powers back, like everything after that was like fine. It was just like that introduction where it was just quite slow. And again, I get like why it was done, and I get like the obviously like the character choice and how it fits within the character. But just as like as a movie going person, it was just, I don't know. It was just taking me out. But again for me, like I'm just saying that's like more personal as opposed to like it being too much of a negative as to some of the character himself and some of the movie itself. And that's why I said at the start that it wasn't quite for me, this particular movie, just because it's just not my style, and a lot of some of the stuff that was kind of like happening in it just wasn't my style, and it just didn't quite fit. And again, like I'm famous for in on this podcast for saying that I don't really like horror, and that's changed quite a bit, since doing this, but this particular style just fell flat on me, and it was part of the performances as well was just like sort of not helping with sort of having me immersed in this or sort of appreciating what was going on.
And I think Gothic horror in general, but this movie specifically, works mostly on an emotional and then a symbolic level, where if you try to make too much sense of it in a literal way, it simply doesn't work. So I think there are a couple of scenes where they very much choose style over substance, right? So one example of this is when Thomas is with the in the small village in Transylvania near the castle, and his horse is stolen, so he has to walk the rest. And he's kind of been walking for hours, and he's walking down this forest road, and he's on the brink of exhaustion. Orlok sends this carriage towards him, right? And the carriage drives towards him, and he walks in the middle of the road, and then the carriage almost runs him over, and we have this hard cut to horses almost running him over, right? And then the next cut is to the carriage standing in the middle of the road, and the door swings open is opened by an invisible hand, right? Looks cool, makes no sense. Why does Orlok try to run him over? Why does Thomas not walk to the side? Like, if I'm walking down a forest road and there's something coming towards me, a car or a horse carriage or something, I move to the side, right? So, and I understand that there's probably a symbolic interpretation of this, and it works on a vibes level. Like, it's a really cool scene if you just watch it. But then at the back of my mind, I have to think, why is anybody doing this? Why is Orlok trying to run him over? Why is Thomas not getting, before he knows that Orlok sent this carriage? Could be anybody, right? So why did he not move to the side? If he was so exhausted that he didn't really see the carriage, but that's not established either. So that's an example of a scene where it's a cool visual, and maybe there's a symbolic interpretation of it that you can come up with, but it doesn't, characters are not acting like people in that, or the cause and effect is not really apparent, at least to me. Another one is when Thomas tries to escape the castle and he cannot open the gate, and so he kind of wanders into the crypt where Orlok's coffin is. Unless I was kind of spaced out for half a second, I didn't see a reason for why he went into that crypt. If you're trying to escape, why are you going into the basement? You know what I mean, right? Mm. It certainly leads to a situation in which there's a confrontation where he's tempted to kill Orlok, and Orlok wakes up and punishes him for it, and so on. I understand why the scene is there as part of the movie, but I don't understand why Thomas made those steps, why he made those choices to go this way instead of that way and stuff like that. And then my third example is when Orlok arrives in Wisborg and he brings the plague with him. I understand that symbolizes death, and that death brings death and stuff like that, right? And on a symbolic level, I understand why it happens. But first of all, why does he want to kill his dinner? Why is this a thing that he wants to do? Why does he want to bring the plague to the city that is supposed to be his buffet? And why didn't this happen in Transylvania? Why were kind of the locals not plague-ridden when Orlok has been living there for generations? And if there's answers to this in the movie, if I missed a line where they explain this, von Franz specifically just happens to have all the occult knowledge that he needs when he needs it, and he just throws them out in one line. And if you blink, you miss it. So if any of this is explained in the movie, then by all means, let us know in the comments. But it seemed to be a thing where the image and the vibes were put first and the story was put second. And that is something that, I think that's generally true of Gothic horror. And whenever I see people praising the movie, I see them praising it on the level of how amazing this is done in the movie. And I'm like, why are people doing this? And I think that is really kind of the culture shock that kind of prevents some people from enjoying this movie. And it seems like we are in that camp.
Is there a way to tell a good story through visuals and symbolism without sort of necessarily having it entirely done through the story? And I'm trying to think of examples of it, and I can't off the top of my head because it's not sort of normally in my wheelhouse. But I don't know. Do you guys feel like there is a way of sort of doing something like this the right way, where even people that don't normally delve into sort of the genre are able to kind of appreciate the story it's trying to tell through the visuals and symbols, etc.
In general, my preference is for movies to be more self-contained, and that so in the sense of just by following what happens in the plot, you can understand what's going on, and then things like symbolism and background knowledge that you have can enhance your experience. I think this doesn't work in this movie. I think this presents you with images, and if you don't have the right literary or cinematic background, and you've seen the right movies, you've seen the right books, you are familiar with the right metaphors and whatever, then it's just not there. And I'm not sure that that is good storytelling exactly. It's not my preference. I would have much preferred it if the plot, like on a basic level, was logical and characters acted in understandable ways, and then we layer symbolism on top of that to give it more depth and give it added dimension. That would be how I would want the movie to do it. I'm not ready to call it a bad movie just because I think all of this is very intentional and very literate and very, like, it sounds like I don't know much about Robert Eggert, and I don't necessarily care a lot about directors, like, or like their history with a certain story and so on, and their life story and so on. But I've heard that he's been wanting to do Nosferatu for a long time, and this is kind of his passion project, which ironically is also his most accessible and probably financially successful one. Like, all the others were a little bit more niche and a little bit more special in terms of what you needed to bring to it to understand it. And that's the reason I haven't seen The Witch and The Northman yet. And this one is, I think, by far the most accessible and approachable. And I think you still need to bring a very specific background to it to make sense of it. Because that's what I'm seeing in the positive reviews, that they basically treat, like, Ellen's plot purely on a thematic and symbolic level, and how it's this, like, amazing love story or meditation on love and passion and loneliness and so on. And it's like, is it based on what's in the movie? In part, yeah, but I think people are bringing a lot into this movie from outside. If you're not doing that, or if you bring something different, then it stops working in some places, I think. And I think individually, none of that is a huge problem. But when the end hinges on it, then that's when it's a bit of a bigger deal, I think.
So how do you feel about the ending?
So I like the urban fantasy genre a lot, so like mythical creatures in modern day. And one of the tropes in that genre is that humans cannot fight the monsters in a fair fight, but these monsters have weaknesses. And once you understand that weakness, you can exploit that, and then you can win. So, for example, that demons cannot break a contract, that fairies cannot tell a lie, that vampires have a compulsion to count. There are versions of the vampire myth where if you take, like, a fistful of rice and throw it on the ground, the vampire is compelled to count it, and you can just run, and that gives you time to run away, for example. Werewolves and Silver is a similar one. Each of these creatures tends to have weaknesses or compulsions that can be exploited. And that's basically what's happening here. So in the Wikipedia summary, the way they phrase it as, von Franz, from his occult research, theorizes that the Nosferatu can only truly be destroyed through the willing sacrifice of a fair maiden, and he and Ellen hatch a plan to trap Orlok and keep Thomas diverted, as she chooses to sacrifice herself to save the city. So that answers my question earlier about whether or not they made that plan together, and I have no recollection of this happening. Might have dozed off for 2 seconds, but, like, I don't understand the symbolism of willing sacrifice of the fair maiden and why Orlok is compelled to do that. Why he cannot resist the temptation of Ellen, right? Because that's what's happening, right? Like, he doesn't even realize that morning is approaching until it's too late, and he doesn't because he's in her spell, right? And I don't understand the symbolism of that. I don't understand why a vampire would behave this way, because typically the vampire is the one who controls, like, the vampire is typically the predator and humans are the prey, and that is why vampires typically have mind control powers and can kind of cloud our minds and hypnotize us and things like that. And here the opposite of is happening, and I don't really understand why that is the case, like, where that symbolism comes from. Like, there are things like vampires being vulnerable to garlic has something to do with medieval Christian symbolism, in which garlic symbolizes purity. And that is kind of lost on a modern audience, but you can look it up. Like, there's something we're familiar enough with that we don't question it. But if you see a vampire story for the first time, it can seem kind of random. Why garlic? And I think this might be a bit similar, where I don't know where this comes from. And it's also not something that has been done in other vampire stories that I've seen. And as a result, I find it confusing.
Is it a common theme in sort of like vampire stories where they have like this infatuation with a woman, or infatuated by sort of like some type of like love interest or a particular person, where they can essentially kind of like lose themselves in that.
I've seen stories where they fixate on somebody and really want to win the prize of this one mortal, but not to the point where they lose control and completely are unable to control their actions. That's just not something I've seen in other vampire stories. And I don't know if this is something the German version in 1922 made up, or if this comes from somewhere else. But this is not part of the vampire stories I've seen before. Typically, it's the other way around, where humans are the ones who are kind of at the mercy of the vampire's influence. And this happens kind of in this one too, right? Where Nock is completely taken over by the psychic presence of Orlok, and Ellen is in that position for a while as well. And like on some level, I can kind of see that, okay, maybe it's because there is this link between them. She realizes it's a two-way street, but Orlok doesn't, or he doesn't realize until it's too late. Fine, but it's not. I don't think it's made very explicit. And it seems to me that if you are not using kind of established kind of tropes, then you need to establish them. And they kind of establish them in this case simply by von Franz kind of just stating it, saying is in my research I have found that this is the case. And then they do it, and then they win. And it seems a bit like a plot device to me. Like if this was a new story where an author just came up with this, I would say, you want to justify that a little bit? Like, do you want to flesh that out a little bit? And maybe because it's Eggers and because it's like a classic silent film and stuff like that, people are not asking those questions. Or it's got its roots in something else that I'm not familiar with. But it's definitely not like a major part of the vampire mythology.
One thing I have realized, though, when it comes to some vampire movies, I swear they're like, some vampires have like a fixation on a specific person's blood. So that's what I think they were trying to do with this in terms of like where Orlok's obsession came from. Of course, like they have a bond, right? Cool. But I think even like in Twilight, even though it's not really a great depiction of what, vampire mythology, but like in like other movies, I've seen like vampires where there's like a specific person where they have like a strong fixation and an obsession of like drinking them. So I think maybe that's where Orlok's kind of obsession came from. So it's not necessarily the person, but it's like her blood is what like his fixation was, like the thought of like that was like his fantasy in a way, because obviously it was like it was very sexual, but at the same time it's like the thoughts came from like him actually just like sucking her dry. So I think the fixation of her blood is what caused his obsession.
So the vibes that I got is that he's just in love with her, that he's so obsessed with her that he simply cannot control himself, and that he kind of just loses himself in her spell. I don't think it's about the blood. I think it's about the psychic link, and it's about him having fixated on her. And I think that is different from like what's different to other vampire stories is that he loses complete control, that she is able to kind of hypnotize him because of that link that they have and because of the love he feels for her, to the point where like this centuries-old vampire cannot simply say, it's almost sunrise, I'm going to come back tomorrow and there's nothing you can do about it. Does he not have that patience after being around for hundreds of years? That was the disconnect for me, that I didn't understand where the compulsion came from, to the point where he was completely helpless.
I hear what you're saying, but I can't allow myself to believe that's the reason, because that's, like I said, that's such a human craving to have, if that makes sense. Like and Nosferatu is not human. Do you know what I'm saying? So like you've been around for how many years, and all of a sudden love over this human girl is what's causing you to kind of like,
I mean,
do you know what I'm saying? It just kind of like you to abandon like your evilness, if that makes sense, and just like it just, do you know what I'm saying? Like, it just doesn't make sense that it would be something so generic that makes him kind of like go out of element. That doesn't make that. I find it very hard to believe that's it. For me personally, I think it has to do something with his blood. I think the love kind of like entwines with her blood, if that makes sense. So he's in love with her, but he's kind of like in love with the thought. It's like lust in a way, right? Think about it. It's like lust. A lot of the times lust can make you think that you love someone, but in reality, it's not love. It's it's lust. You know what I'm saying? So I think that's what it is with him. It's like his love mainly comes from lust, and his lust is obviously sucking her blood.
Well, I mean, like in all the reviews and interpretations, and even in the movie itself, it's described as love. It's this idea that he has this deep connection to this one mortal, and it's completely consuming him. And I get that that's what's going on, and I'm asking, so what? Why is that interesting? Why is it interesting that like vampires in my mind are kind of the ultimate predators, right? Like they treat humans as cattle and as prey and as playthings, right? While at the same time having kind of superficially things that we want, like eternal youth and wealth and sophistication and perfect health and all of these things. But it comes at the cost of their humanity, and it's a facade that hides like an animal that will tear you apart if you let it. Right? To me, that's what makes vampires cool. And there are many different versions of this story, right? Or this archetype. And they don't all have to be the same. It doesn't have to be what I want it to be, or it doesn't have to be what I expect it to be. But it seems like turning the table on this ultimate predator should be kind of a big deal. And it kind of just happens. It doesn't seem to be this big realization. It doesn't seem to be Ellen realizing, oh, I thought I was the victim, but actually the connection goes both ways. And he's underestimating me because I'm the prey, and that gives me an advantage, and now I can lay a trap. That, to me, that makes sense. But if it's just Orlok is so in love that he just walks right into her trap and doesn't realize it until it's too late, like, to me, that's something I associate with youth, right? Like, that's the kind of thing that like a horny, love-struck teenager does, right? That's what a 15-year-old does. They experience love for the first time, and it's so overwhelming, and they have no context for it, that they think this is the most profound thing anybody has ever felt. And so they do stupid and reckless things that maybe open them up to exploitation or something. Yeah. Like, to me, that those are things I associate with youth. And in this movie, it's the other way around. It's the old, sophisticated, powerful party is the one that kind of completely loses control because they are so in love. And that's the exact opposite of what's intuitive to me. And if it's so counterintuitive, then you can still make that work. But it seems to me it would need some elaboration. And it shouldn't just be like this happens. It should be a bigger deal, and a bigger part of the story should be justified in the story. I don't know. All I can really report is that I was watching this, and I was like, the last 15 minutes or so where this happens was really disorienting for me because I didn't understand why it was happening. And if the movie gives us the tools to understand this and I just missed them, then that's fair enough. But I'm not sure I missed all of them. Isn't it the movie's job to communicate this stuff in a way where it makes sense, at least in hindsight? And I'm not sure it does here. I think you have to bring a very specific interpretation and mindset to it, and then it makes sense if you say, okay, this is about like the most intense, pure love anybody has ever felt or whatever, and that's when it makes sense. But I think that interpretation brings things to the table from outside, and it doesn't seem to be built up and justified within the movie itself. And it's kind of what a movie is supposed to do. And that's kind of the thing I'm kind of stuck on. And maybe if I watch it 2 more times, I'll see the pieces or whatever, but I'm just not. And I'm hedging my words here a little bit because I think Robert Eggers is a really smart filmmaker, in that a lot of thought and effort and attention to detail goes into these movies. And this seems like a really glaring oversight. And so I'm a little bit self-conscious about maybe I just missed it. And I certainly missed the part where von Franz figures out the whole thing about the innocent maiden thing, which still doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Like, I just don't get the symbolism of that. But there must be other things I also missed. So it's a bit weird.
I'll definitely say if that is the reason, if love is the reason, then it doesn't hold no weight. I think he does mention that she's different from all the other humans. And like, obviously that pretty much tells us that she's special. And I can see why, he would be more transfixed on her than, any other, human being, because it's like, cool. So you already established that she's different.
It is said that some people have an intuitively strong psychic mind, and she's one of the strongest, and therefore she is the first to make the connection with Orlok. And then Nock is the next person, right, who also has this affinity, and so he feels that presence earlier than most, but Ellen is by far the most advanced in that area. And that's fine, right? Like, if you just, like a lot of stories like this have this, where some people, and Dracula had this too, where some people just have an affinity for like the psychic presence of a vampire, and so they are more susceptible and pick up on it earlier than others. And I'm fine with that. It's just what happens because of that is a little bit not intuitive to me.
I'll keep it simple, man. Just Not for me. Good visuals. I mean, if you're a filmmaker, probably want to watch in terms of just kind of like seeing the imagery, sort of the build up of like dread, the build up of sort of atmosphere in this, sort of setting the scene, etc. Like it's all done, really, really well in this movie. But story wise, just doesn't fall in my kind of like wheelhouse, doesn't fall into sort of what I'm typically interested in. So for me, it just kind of like felt a little bit flat, but I can appreciate it for what it is. So I will give it I don't want to be harsh, but I'll give it a 4 out of 10.
For me, like I said, I think it was a good movie, but nothing special. I think mainly it was a good movie because of how Nosferatu was pretty much the star of this film. I get it. I of course, it's based on him, so of course he's going to be the star of the film. But I think they just like the visuals just matched his character, and he just had moments that were very like uncomfortable and settling. I think the whole like vampire lore and the way that was done was really like it felt like I said it felt dark, dread, and seductive at the same time. So that's crazy. Seductive in the sense where he's seducting his prey before devouring them. But I think that's main how for me that's what makes it a good movie. In terms of the other characters, I think that's where I was lacking because they just lacked interest, depth, and you could say relatability. Overall, I had a good experience. Mainly, like I said, mainly because I was for Nosferatu in terms of mainly for Orlok. But like I did say, it was lacking. It was lacking in many areas. So I'm gonna give this one a 6.5 out of 10.
Yeah, so I think the movie is gorgeous. Atmosphere-wise, it's excellent. When the plot is on rails, it's quite good. I like how the time and place and the era and the culture and everything is realized. It really feels like you're peeking into a different world and a different time. I think just on a visual vibes level, Orlok is one of the cooler vampires we've seen in a long time. It's just towards the end, the plot kind of lost me because it wasn't as explicit and as clear about what it was trying to do. And so I give it a Shrek out of 5.
All right, guys, thank you very much for tuning in today's episode.
Yeah, let us know your thoughts down below in the comment section. Let us know what you thought about the story and how it unfolded, the symbolism, etc. And let us know what you think we missed in this as well. And of course, if you liked our discussion, tell a friend. And if you hated what we discussed today, tell an enemy. We are the Eye of the Storm podcast.
All right, guys, thank you very much, and we will catch you next week. Au revoir.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.